The polished brass compass, worn smooth by years of silent devotion, slipped from Lena's grasp. It clattered against the worn oak workbench, a sharp, metallic ring cutting through the workshop's usual hum of quiet industry. Mr. Sterling Finch, his suit a stark, unwrinkled contrast to the shop's comfortable disarray, smirked. "Exhibit A," he drawled, his voice oily, "of the unsuitable activities we've observed. This item poses a health and safety risk, and its owner, frankly, is a disruptive element." Evie Thorne stepped forward, her hands, usually stained with grease and with dust, clenched into fists. "That item is a veteran's lifeline," she said, her voice low, trembling with a fury she rarely allowed to surface. "And that owner saved lives. You lay one more finger on her, Mr. Finch, and you'll regret it." Finch's smile didn't falter, but his eyes, cold and calculating, narrowed. "Regret is a luxury, Miss Thorne. Unlike this establishment, which as of this moment is condemned. You have 24 hours to vacate." Evie Thorne stood amidst the scent of sawdust, old oil, and the faint, lingering aroma of forgotten dreams. The mender's bench wasn't just a workshop, it was a cathedral of forgotten things, a haven for the broken and the beautiful. Located on a forgotten street in Havenwood, a Rust Belt town that had seen its best days fade with the closing of the nearby Fort Ridley, the shop was a testament to Evie's quiet resilience. She was 47, her hands calloused, her eyes sharp and kind, framed by lines etched from years of leaning over intricate mechanisms. She'd inherited the mender's bench from her uncle Silas, a gruff but gentle Korean War vet who believed that anything broken could be fixed, given enough patience and a little love. He'd taught her the language of gears and springs, the silent poetry of wood grain, and, most importantly, the unspoken needs of men and women who carried burdens heavier than any antique clock. Her own burden was her brother, Liam, a Marine lost in Afghanistan, not to enemy fire, but to the silence that followed the war. He'd come home but never truly returned. Evie had seen him drift, lost and unmoored until the day he simply wasn't there anymore. The mender's bench became her way of fighting back against that silence, a place where she hoped others might find the quiet hum of purpose that had eluded Liam. It was a place for veterans, not just to fix watches or restore old radios, but to mend themselves piece by painstaking piece. Every Tuesday they held Quiet Craft, a gathering where veterans could work on projects, share skills, or simply exist in a space that understood their need for both camaraderie and solitude. There were no therapists, no formal programs, just the rhythmic rasp of sandpaper, the gentle tap of a hammer, and the shared understanding that some wounds healed best in silence. Ralph, a Vietnam vet with hands like gnarled oak, meticulously carved wooden birds. Maria, a young army medic, found solace in soldering circuit boards for old radios. And then there was Lena. Sergeant Lena Petrova, a former Army EOD specialist, was the quietest of them all. She arrived every morning at 7 a.m. sharp before the first rays of sun truly warmed the shop window and settled into her corner. She never spoke. Not a word. Her eyes, deep and shadowed, held a story Evie couldn't decipher, a landscape of untold horrors. Her only constant companion was a dented brass field compass. She would sit for hours meticulously polishing it with a soft cloth, her movements almost ritualistic. The compass was her anchor, her world. Evie never asked, never probed. She just made sure Lena had her space, a fresh cup of water, and the quiet comfort of the workshop. She understood that for some, just being was an act of profound courage. But Havenwood was changing, or rather, it was being changed. Apex Holdings, a slick urban renewal corporation, had descended upon the town like a flock of predatory birds. Their representative, Mr. Sterling Finch, was a man who saw only profit margins and blight where Evie saw history and humanity. He wanted the mender's bench gone, along with the entire block of dilapidated but beloved storefronts. He called it revitalization. Evie called it erasure. Finch had been circling for weeks, leaving notices, sending veiled threats. His latest tactic was to declare the shop a public nuisance, citing unconventional clientele and unlicensed activities. He'd hinted at Lena, her silent presence a convenient target for his corporate aggression. This morning, he hadn't just hinted. He'd walked in, flanked by two burly security guards, his clipboard held like a weapon. He'd found Lena, lost in her ritual, and tried to snatch the compass. That's when Evie had stepped in. "This is a formal condemnation notice, Ms. Thorne," Finch reiterated, his voice dripping with false civility, holding up a laminated document. "Any continued occupancy will result in immediate legal action and forcible removal." Evie looked at Lena, who had curled in on herself, her face pale, her hands trembling, eyes fixed on the compass lying on the bench. The small, quiet circle of veterans in the shop had gone utterly still, their tools forgotten, their gazes locked on Finch. They understood. This wasn't just about a shop, it was about their sanctuary, their fragile peace. You won't get a single veteran out of this shop, Mr. Finch, Evie stated, her voice now steady, resonating with a quiet authority that surprised even herself. Not while I'm standing. And if that means I lose everything, then so be it. Some things are worth losing for. A low murmur rippled through the gathered veterans. Ralph, the wood carver, slowly put down his chisel, his eyes, usually gentle, now sharp and cold. Maria, the medic, clenched her soldering iron. Finch chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. Noble, Miss Thorne. But irrelevant. The law is the law. And this hovel is a liability. Especially with that. He gestured vaguely at Lena and the compass. A woman who doesn't speak, polishing a piece of junk. It's bad for business. Bad for the New Havenwood. Just then, a young man named Alex, a new apprentice Evie had taken on, stepped forward from behind a dusty lathe. He'd been filming on his phone, a habit of his generation. Finch hadn't noticed. Alex's face was pale, but his hand was steady. He pressed a button and the small, red recording light blinked on. You're wrong, Mr. Finch, Alex said, his voice surprisingly clear. She's not a liability. She's a hero. Finch scoffed. A hero? Polishing a compass? Get out of my way, boy. She's Sergeant Lena Petrova, Alex continued, ignoring Finch, his voice gaining strength. EOD. Saved countless lives. Including General Vance's life back in Kandahar. That compass, that's the compass. Finch faltered. His eyes darted to the phone, then back to Lena, then to Evie. The air in the workshop crackled with unspoken history. Lena, for the first time in months, slowly lifted her head. Her eyes, still shadowed, met Evie's. A flicker of something, recognition, gratitude, passed between them. This is a private matter, Finch stammered, regaining some composure. And you, Miss Thorne, are now officially in breach of contract. Your lease is terminated. Effective immediately. He turned on his heel, his security guards following, leaving behind the acrid scent of his expensive cologne and the crushing weight of his words. Evie watched him go, a cold dread seeping into her bones. 6 years. 6 years of building, of mending, of creating a sanctuary. Gone. Just like that. She looked at the quiet faces of the veterans, the silent accusation in their eyes, not at her, but at the injustice. She felt the familiar ache in her chest, the ghost of Liam's fading smile. This wasn't just her shop, it was their shop. She untied her worn apron, its pockets heavy with small tools and the ghosts of countless repairs. Her hands trembled, but her resolve hardened. She folded the apron carefully, placed it on the workbench beside Lena's compass. Keep the light on, Alex, she murmured, her voice hoarse. And make sure Lena has her tea. She walked out, the bell above the door jingling a mournful tune. No one followed. They sat, frozen, watching the empty space where she had stood. But somewhere, out in the invisible currents of the internet, a quiet act of defiance, a line drawn in the dust of a forgotten workshop, had just been broadcast to the world. For 35 minutes, the mender's bench was silent. The rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed deafening. Customers who had wandered in, drawn by the usual quiet hum, now stood awkwardly, some leaving their half-finished projects. Alex, the young apprentice, stayed at his post, his phone still clutched in his hand, the video he'd recorded already uploaded, already spreading. He kept glancing at Lena, who had returned to her compass, polishing it with a renewed, almost desperate intensity. The dog-eared photo of Evie's brother, Liam, pinned to a corkboard behind the counter, seemed to watch them all, a silent witness. And then a low rumble began. Not the distant thunder of a Georgia storm, but something heavier, more deliberate. It grew, vibrating through the old floorboards, rattling the glass in the display cases. It wasn't a single vehicle, it was a convoy. Outside, the morning light, usually soft and golden, was cut by the stark, flashing blue of official vehicles. 4 black SUVs, polished to a mirror sheen, pulled up, followed by a mobile command unit, its antenna bristling. They formed a silent, imposing blockade outside the mender's bench. Doors opened in unison and out stepped General Vivian Vance. She was a formidable woman, even in her civilian travel suit. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her posture ramrod straight, and her eyes, though tired, held the piercing gaze of someone who had seen too much and understood more than most. She wore no uniform, but her presence commanded a parade ground. Behind her, a dozen uniformed personnel, a mix of Army and VA officials, moved with crisp, efficient purpose. Inside, Sterling Finch, who had returned to gloat, stood frozen near a display of antique tools, his smug expression replaced by one of bewildered terror. He fumbled with his phone, trying to make a call, but his fingers seemed to have forgotten how to dial. General Vance entered alone. Her stride was purposeful, her gaze sweeping the room, taking in the quiet veterans, the dust motes dancing in the sunlight, the worn wood, and finally, Lena huddled over her compass. Their eyes met across the cluttered space. Lena stiffened, a barely perceptible flinch, then slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. The general returned it, a silent, profound acknowledgement. "Mr. Finch," General Vance's voice cut through the silence like a sharpened blade. "I believe you were just attempting to condemn this establishment?" Finch stammered, his face paling. "General Vance. I was merely enforcing city code. Health and safety regulations, you see. This animal," he pointed a trembling finger at Lena and the compass. General Vance didn't raise her voice, but the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "That animal, Mr. Finch, is Sergeant Lena Petrova. Army UD. Silver Star recipient. And that piece of junk she holds is the very compass that guided her team to a hidden IED in Kandahar, saving my entire forward reconnaissance unit. My life, Mr. Finch, is owed to that piece of junk and the soldier who held it." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The veterans, who had known Lena only as the silent woman with the compass, now looked at her with a new, profound awe. Lena, for the first time, looked up, her eyes wide, a faint flush coloring her pale cheeks. "And Miss Thorne," General Vance continued, turning her gaze to the empty space where Evie had stood, "was fired for defending a decorated soldier and her service artifact. Is that correct?" Alex, the apprentice, stepped forward, his phone still in hand. "Yes, ma'am. I recorded it all." General Vance nodded, her expression grim. "Then you, Mr. Finch, have just made a grave error. Not just legally, but morally." She turned to her team. "Initiate federal acquisition protocols. This property, as of now, is under federal jurisdiction. And Mr. Finch, I suggest you contact your legal counsel. You'll be hearing from the Department of Justice." Finch gaped, his jaw hanging slack. Deborah Lyle, a regional manager for Apex Holdings who had arrived minutes before the general, stood frozen, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. General Vance stepped outside, pulling out her satellite phone. A moment later, Alex's phone buzzed. He looked down, confused. It's a direct message from the Pentagon," he whispered, his eyes wide. "They've requested Evie Thorne report to the Office of Veteran Affairs. Today." Lena, still clutching her compass, slowly, almost imperceptibly, smiled. And in the workshop that once held only the quiet hum of repairs, something entirely new was brewing, a reckoning. Evie sat in her old pickup truck on the edge of her driveway, keys in hand, but the engine off. She'd been there for 15 minutes, still in her shop clothes, grease-stained jeans, a worn flannel, and boots that had seen more spilled solvent than she cared to count. She stared out at the familiar road, replaying Finch's smug face, the condemnation notice, the quiet despair of her veterans. Fired. Evicted. For doing the right thing. And now a summons from the Pentagon? It felt surreal, a bad dream overlaid with something impossibly grand. She didn't know what it meant, if it was good or bad, but deep down, a tremor of something larger than herself had begun. She took a breath, turned the ignition, and headed down the familiar road she'd driven hundreds of times before. Only this time she wasn't going to the hardware store for supplies. This time she was heading into a storm. The Office of Veteran Affairs building in Washington, D.C. stood like a monument to bureaucracy, polished granite, hushed corridors, the distant murmur of important conversations. Evie felt like an alien, her worn clothes and calloused hands out of place amidst the crisp uniforms and tailored suits. General Vivian Vance met her at the door. She wasn't in uniform now, just a sharp charcoal pantsuit, but her presence was no less commanding. "Miss Thorne," she said, extending a firm hand. "Thank you for coming. I imagine you have questions." Evie shook her hand, still unsure. "Still not entirely sure why I'm here, General. Let me show you something." General Vance led her down a hallway lined with photographs of soldiers, maps of forgotten battlefields, and commendation plaques. They stopped in front of a door labeled Veterans Forge and Resilience Initiative. Inside, the room was vast, filled with empty workbenches, unpowered lathes, and boxes of new, gleaming tools. A few young staffers moved quietly, setting up ergonomic chairs and organizing toolkits. "This is a new pilot program," General Vance explained, her voice softening slightly. "We've been trying to get it off the ground for years. Trouble is, it's hard to find someone who understands vets, not just from paperwork, but from the inside. Someone who understands that healing isn't always about talking, sometimes it's about doing." Evie folded her arms, a familiar defensiveness rising. "I'm not a therapist. I don't have a degree in social work. I just fix things." "No," General Vance said, a faint smile touching her lips. "You built a place where men and women with invisible wounds came to heal. You did more with salvaged wood and a quiet corner than some programs do with $1 million budget. Evie didn't answer right away. She thought of Lena, of Ralph, of Maria, of all the quiet souls who had found respite in the rhythmic work of their hands. General Vance stepped closer, her tone intimate. You created a sanctuary without realizing it. What you did in that workshop, that was leadership. That was service. Then, from a back room, a voice, hesitant but clear, called out, "Is that her?" A young woman stepped out, mid-20s, her face etched with a complex tapestry of scars, her hand resting on the head of a golden retriever puppy wearing a red vest marked, "In training." It was Maria, the young medic from Evie's shop. "Hi," Maria said shyly. I wanted to say I saw the video. The one Alex posted. I haven't been able to touch a soldering iron since I came home. But I think I could work in a place you run." She gestured to the empty workbenches. Evie blinked. The air in her chest, tight with apprehension, suddenly shifted, expanding with a warmth she hadn't felt in days. General Vance smiled. "We'd like to offer you a position, Miss Thorne. Not as a figurehead, not as a name on a brochure, but as the director of the center. You'd run the programs, build the space, shape the culture. You already know what works. Community, routine, respect." Evie exhaled, a long, slow release. "You're serious?" As a heart attack, the general affirmed. "We want to replicate what you built in Havenwood. A place where veterans can find purpose through craft, where their hands can heal what their minds can't yet process. A place where a compass isn't just a navigation tool, but a symbol of resilience." Evie looked at Maria, now kneeling, gently stroking her puppy. She thought of Lena, of the dozens of men and women who'd found their way to the mender's bench, not for profit, but for peace. And suddenly she knew. "I'll do it," she said quietly. The general nodded once. "Then let's get to work." That night, Evie stood alone in what would soon be the new heart of the Veterans Forge and Resilience Initiative. The walls were bare, the floors still scuffed from construction, but the air felt full of something sacred. She reached into her bag and took out an old, faded photograph. Liam, her brother, younger, full of life, standing outside the mender's bench holding a half-finished wooden bird. She pinned it to the wall. No plaque, no frame, just memory and mission. Word spread faster than she imagined. By the end of the week, the Veterans Forge and Resilience Initiative wasn't just another government pilot program. It had become something alive, a beacon. Veterans who hadn't stepped foot in a public space in years showed up. Young soldiers returned with hesitant spouses. Even the Havenwood Herald, the local newspaper, ran a full-page spread, from workshop to Washington, how Evie Thorne is forging hope, one veteran at a time. Evie didn't do anything flashy. She didn't bring in fancy speakers or high-priced consultants. She just did what she'd always done. She paid attention. She asked names and remembered them. She posted a whiteboard near the tool storage that read, "Who needs a ride? Who needs an extra pair of hands?" She let service dogs curl up in corners of therapy rooms without a fuss. She kept that same handwritten notebook from the mender's bench, adding new pages for every veteran who walked through the door. Some days were quiet, some were hard, some were full of nothing but the rhythmic scrape of sandpaper and the soft click of gears. But something powerful was building, a space where pain wasn't hidden and healing didn't need to be loud. Lena came often now. She still didn't speak much, but she would sit at her accustomed workbench, her compass gleaming, and sometimes Evie would catch her eyes and a flicker of something resembling peace would pass between them. Maria, the young medic, brought her golden retriever puppy, now named Beacon, and slowly, hesitantly began to teach other veterans how to solder. Alex, the apprentice, had moved to DC to work with Evie, his phone still ready to capture moments of quiet courage. But not everyone was thrilled. Some officials questioned why someone with no formal training was running a federal pilot program. Auditors arrived quietly, clipboards in hand, their suits stiff with skepticism. They examined logs, asked probing questions, even tested the air filters in the ventilation system. At the end of their review, one inspector, a stern woman with a sharp gaze, looked Evie dead in the eye and asked, "What certifications do you hold that qualify you to counsel veterans in this capacity?" Evie didn't blink. "I don't have certifications," she said softly. "Just consistency. And kindness." The inspector didn't respond, but she took notes. A week later, Evie received a formal notice. The Veterans Forge and Resilience Initiative was being reviewed for possible national model expansion. General Vance called it a victory. Evie just called it humbling. Even as the center grew, the mender's bench still tugged at her heart. One afternoon, she returned quietly, unannounced. Alex was behind the counter, looking older, more confident. "You're supposed to be famous now, Miss Thorne," he teased, sliding a freshly polished old pocket watch across the counter. "I'm just here for a memory," Evie said, smiling. The shop had changed. Photos of veterans now lined the walls, Ralph, Maria, Lena, and others. A new sign had been hung near the entrance. It read, "The Mender's Bench, where every broken thing finds its purpose." Later that day, Evie drove across town to speak at a local fundraiser for veteran families. It was a modest event, mostly older folks and kids with crayon posters. She spoke without notes. "I didn't set out to build a program," she said. "I just refused to throw out a man and his dog. Or, in my case, a woman and her compass." The crowd fell silent, then applause. Loud, long, real? And somewhere in the back, Lena Petrova, standing tall, her silver star pinned to her simple blouse, gave Evie a quiet salute. For the first time, Evie saw not a broken soldier, but a whole woman. Back at the center that night, Evie sat alone by the wall of photos. She added one more, a picture of the conference crowd giving her a standing ovation. Beside it, she taped the old photo of Liam, and beside that, a new photo of Lena holding her compass, a faint, genuine smile on her face. And below them, she wrote a simple line, "Honor grows where kindness is consistent." As she turned to leave, a young veteran with nervous eyes stepped through the door. "Is this the place for, people like us?" Evie smiled gently. "No, son. This is the place for people like all of us." And just like that, her circle wasn't just full, it was open. 3 weeks after the conference, a letter arrived. It came in a sealed envelope, stamped with the gold emblem of the Department of Defense. General Vance handed it to Evie personally. They stood inside her office at the Veterans Forge and Resilience Center, surrounded by the quiet hum of a space still learning how to heal. The general didn't say much, just, "You'll want to sit for this." Evie opened it slowly, the official language blurring as her eyes scanned the first line, "You are hereby nominated for the National Civilian Commendation for Distinguished Service to Veterans." She read it again. Then again. "I didn't do anything special," she whispered. General Vance chuckled. "That's exactly why you're getting it." The letter came with an invitation not just to attend a ceremony in Washington but to speak at the National Veterans Advocacy Conference. Evie felt her knees go weak. "I'm not a public speaker. You are now." The day she left for D.C., she packed light, just one blazer, an old watch of Liam's, and the same worn notebook she'd used behind the Mender's bench counter for years. Names, birthdays, notes like, "Maria prefers soldering small components," and "Don't ask Ralph about the incident unless he brings it up." That notebook had carried more weight than any resume. As she waited at the airport gate, she heard someone call her name. "Need a ride, Miss Thorne?" She turned to see Lena Petrova standing tall, in her perfectly pressed dress greens, the silver star gleaming on her chest. Beacon, the golden retriever, sat calmly by her side, tail gently wagging. "The general assigned me as your escort," Lena said, her voice soft but clear. Evie laughed, half nerves, half awe. "You clean up pretty good, Sergeant." Lena smirked. "You're the one about to speak to the Pentagon." The ballroom at the conference was larger than she expected. White tablecloths, polished brass podium, cameras at every angle. Her name glowed on the screen behind her in elegant lettering. When she stepped up to the microphone, her voice was smaller than the room, but the room leaned in. "I'm not a general. I'm not a doctor. I didn't write policy. I managed a small repair shop in a forgotten town. I fix broken things." I listened. A pause. But in that space, I watched something sacred happen. Veterans came, not for advice, but for presence. They didn't need to be fixed. They needed to be seen. People nodded. A few wiped away tears. One day, Evie continued, her voice gaining strength, "I was fired for letting a woman sit quietly with her brass compass. That was the moment everything changed. But the truth is, it was never about the compass. It was about dignity." Applause thundered through the hall. Lena stood in the back. She didn't cheer. She didn't clap. She just nodded like a soldier hearing her orders finally, clearly. Later that night, as the sun dipped behind the Washington Monument, Evie stepped outside alone. She needed air, silence. A man in a simple gray suit with a white beard approached. Quiet, kind eyes behind thin glasses. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked. She studied his face. It stirred something, a faint echo. He pulled out an old photograph, grainy, faded. It showed a younger Liam in uniform, laughing with an older man, also in uniform, standing outside the Mender's bench long before Liam's last deployment. "You poured me a cup of coffee," the man said, his voice raspy with emotion, "the day I got my medical discharge. You didn't say anything. You just handed me a perfectly mended watch, one I thought was beyond repair. It was the first time I felt like myself again." He held out the photo. "It's yours now." Evie took it with trembling fingers, words caught in her throat. Back home in Havenwood, the town held a welcome celebration. But Evie didn't go straight there. She returned to the wellness center. It was late, quiet. A few veterans still lingered near the fire pit. She walked to the wall of photos, reached into her bag, and added one more, a snapshot of the conference crowd giving her a standing ovation. Beside it, she taped the old shop photo, the one with Liam and the soldier from long ago. And below them, she wrote a simple line, "Honor grows where kindness is consistent." As she turned to leave, a young veteran with nervous eyes stepped through the door. "Is this the place for, people like us?" Evie smiled gently. "No, son. This is the place for people like all of us." And just like that, her circle wasn't just full, it was open. In a world that moves faster every day, it's easy to overlook the quiet moments, the soft-spoken shop owner, the trembling veteran, the gentle wag of a service dog's tail. But sometimes those moments are the ones that shape us. Evie Thorne didn't wear a uniform. She didn't hold rank. But she upheld something sacred, dignity. And in doing so, she reminded us all that honor isn't earned once, it's defended daily. What happened at that small workshop in Havenwood, near a decommissioned base, may seem like a rare story, but maybe it shouldn't be. How many Evies have we walked past without noticing? How many veterans have we thanked only with words, not actions? In today's divided world, Evie's story asks us to pause, to ask ourselves, would I have stood up like she did? Have I ever kept quiet when I should have spoken up? Because sometimes the strongest stand doesn't come with a solution.